It was the kind of dare that seemed harmless at first, the kind of challenge only teenagers would come up with. "Let's have a sleepover in the old Thorn house," Jack had said, grinning mischievously. "It'll be fun. Besides, everyone says it's haunted." We were four: Jack, Sarah, Kevin, and me. The idea of spending the night in the abandoned house on the edge of town was thrilling, a perfect way to end the summer before we all went back to the monotony of school. The Thorn house had been empty for decades, left to rot after the last of the Thorn family mysteriously disappeared one night. It was a staple of local lore, a place where no one dared to tread after dark. Armed with sleeping bags, snacks, and a couple of flashlights, we made our way to the Thorn house as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house loomed before us, its once grand facade now a crumbling relic. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. "Of course," Jack replied confidently. "It's just an old house. There's nothing to be afraid of." We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of mold hung in the air. We set up our sleeping bags in the living room, where the remnants of old furniture were scattered about, covered in grime and cobwebs. As the night grew darker, we entertained ourselves with ghost stories, each tale more gruesome than the last. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of excitement and fear, the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to grow darker and more oppressive with each passing hour. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, and an eerie silence settled over the house. We huddled closer together, the glow from our flashlights casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. "Did you hear that?" Kevin whispered, his eyes wide. We fell silent, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of our own breathing. Then, faintly, we heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on the wall. "It's probably just the wind," Jack said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from upstairs. Against my better judgment, I stood up, flashlight in hand. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to check it out," I replied, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put. Jack and Kevin stood as well, and together we made our way to the staircase. The steps groaned under our weight, and with each step, the tapping grew louder. As we reached the top of the stairs, we saw that the hallway was dark and cold, the air almost palpable with an unseen presence. The tapping led us to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and the sound was louder now, almost deafening. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room was empty, save for an old, tattered armchair in the corner. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. We stood there, unsure of what to do next, when suddenly the door slammed shut behind us. Panic set in, and we rushed to the door, pulling and pounding, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and the air was filled with the faint scent of decay. Then we heard it, a low, guttural whisper, like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Get out." We turned to see a figure standing in the shadows, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes dark and empty. She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Get out," she repeated, her voice rising in a chilling crescendo. We backed away, our fear mounting. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, creeping dread wash over me. She raised a hand, pointing to the door, and I felt an unseen force pushing me towards it. The door flew open, and we stumbled out into the hallway, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We didn't stop to question what had happened. We ran down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until we were back in the safety of the streetlights. We never spoke of that night again. The Thorn house stood silent and dark, its secrets hidden within its decaying walls. But the memory of the woman haunted me, her hollow eyes and chilling voice echoing in my mind. Years later, I learned the truth. The last of the Thorn family, a woman named Eliza, had gone mad after losing her children to a tragic accident. She had been locked away in the house, forgotten by the world, until she had taken her own life. Her spirit lingered, trapped in the place of her torment, and we had unwittingly disturbed her rest. The realization filled me with a cold dread, knowing that her anger had been directed at us and that we had narrowly escaped her wrath. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the tapping, and I know that she is still there, waiting for the next foolish souls to dare enter her domain. And I know that next time, they might not be so lucky. Driving late at night always had a certain allure. The world bathed in moonlight, the roads nearly deserted, and the sense of being the only person awake in a slumbering world. But on this particular night, the thrill had long worn off. Exhaustion clung to me like a second skin, my eyes heavy, my thoughts slow. I had been driving for hours, the dark highway stretching endlessly before me. I had hoped to reach the next town before stopping, but fatigue was winning the battle. The glowing numbers on the dashboard clock told me it was well past midnight, and I knew I needed to find a place to rest. The problem was, there seemed to be no rest stops, no hotels, nothing but the dark, winding road and the dense forest pressing in on either side. Just as I was starting to despair, I saw a sign, weathered and barely legible, pointing to a small dirt road that veered off into the forest. Rest area 2 miles, it promised. Relief washed over me, and I turned onto the narrow path, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness. The road was rough, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. Branches scraped against the car, and the further I drove, the more isolated I felt. After what felt like an eternity, the road opened up into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, decrepit cabin, its wooden walls sagging with age. It was not the rest area I had imagined, but it was a place to stop. I parked the car and sat for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The cabin looked abandoned, but it was shelter. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting through my thin jacket. Gravel crunched underfoot as I approached the cabin, the beam of my flashlight revealing boarded-up windows and a door hanging on rusty hinges. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and neglect. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I explored the single room. There was a rickety table and chair, an old wood-burning stove, and a cot in the corner covered in a layer of dust. It wasn't much, but it would do for a few hours of sleep. I set my flashlight on the table, the beam casting long shadows on the walls. After a quick inspection to ensure there were no unwelcome critters, I lay down on the cot, using my jacket as a pillow. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the distant hoot of an owl. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an irrational fear, I told myself, a product of exhaustion and the eerie surroundings. But the feeling persisted, a prickling at the back of my neck that kept me from fully relaxing. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding. The cabin was pitch black, my flashlight having gone out. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak glow to illuminate the room. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, an almost tangible presence in the darkness. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from outside. I sat up, straining to listen. The noise grew louder, footsteps crunching on the gravel. I held my breath, fear creeping into my veins. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and I could hear someone breathing, slow and steady. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of breathing. I grabbed my flashlight, shaking it until the beam flickered back to life. Slowly I stood and approached the door, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet carrying me forward. I reached for the door handle, and as I did, the breathing stopped. I pushed the door open, shining the flashlight into the night. The clearing was empty, the car sitting undisturbed where I had left it. There was no sign of anyone. I stepped outside, the cold air a sharp contrast to the stuffy cabin. "Is anyone there?" I called again, my voice louder this time, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it was just an animal, I reasoned, or the wind playing tricks on me. I turned to go back inside when I saw them, footprints in the gravel, leading from the edge of the clearing to the door of the cabin. A chill ran down my spine as I followed the footprints with my flashlight. They were fresh, clearly defined in the loose gravel. Someone had been here, standing right outside the door while I slept. Panic surged through me, and I hurried back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and wedging the chair under the handle for good measure. I sat on the cot, clutching the flashlight, my mind racing. Who had been outside? Why hadn't they responded? I checked my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely alone, isolated in this desolate place. Hours passed, the oppressive silence weighing on me. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually claimed me, pulling me into a fitful sleep. I dreamed of shadows moving through the trees, of cold hands reaching for me, of whispered voices calling my name. I woke again, my heart racing. The cabin was silent, but the feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. I sat up, gripping the flashlight, and listened. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from beneath the floorboards. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, moving closer to where I sat. I swung the flashlight beam across the floor, but saw nothing. Gathering my courage, I stood and began to search for the source of the noise. The scratching led me to a corner of the cabin, where the floorboards were loose and rotting. I pried one up, the wood splintering in my hands, and shone the flashlight into the dark space below. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the crawlspace beneath the cabin, was a pile of bones, human bones, tangled together in a macabre embrace. Skulls grinned up at me, their empty eye sockets seeming to follow my every move. A wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. The scratching continued, louder now, and I realized with growing horror that it was coming from all around me. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder and heavier. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted for the door, the chair clattering to the floor as I yanked it open. I ran to the car, my heart pounding, the night air freezing against my skin. I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and scramble inside. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. In the rearview mirror, I saw the cabin receding into the distance, its dark silhouette fading into the trees. As I drove, the scratching sounds faded, replaced by the hum of the engine and the thrum of my own heartbeat. But the sense of dread lingered, a heavy weight in my chest. I knew I had narrowly escaped something terrible, something that defied explanation. I drove until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the safety of civilization slowly returning. I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking as I filled the tank and grabbed a cup of coffee. The clerk gave me a curious look, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far from that cabin as possible. I never spoke of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But the memories haunt me still, the footsteps, the breathing, the bones beneath the floorboards. And sometimes in the dead of night, I wake with a start, the sound of scratching echoing in my ears, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. The cabin had always been there, nestled deep in the heart of the forest, a place whispered about in hushed tones among the townsfolk. Few dared to venture near it, and those who did often returned with tales of eerie sounds and unsettling feelings. It was an old structure, weathered by time and nature, its wooden walls covered in moss and ivy, giving it an almost camouflaged appearance amidst the towering trees. Growing up, I had heard the stories, how children would go missing every few years, last seen playing near the edge of the forest. It was always the same. A search party would be organized, the entire town would scour the woods, but no trace of the children was ever found. Eventually, the search would be called off, and the parents would be left with nothing but heartache and unanswered questions. Despite the warnings, I had never believed in the old legends. I was a skeptic, grounded in reality and logic. But that changed the summer my younger brother Sam disappeared. It was supposed to be a carefree afternoon, just a group of kids playing hide-and-seek near the woods. I was supposed to be watching them, keeping an eye out to make sure they didn't wander too far. But when it was time to go home, Sam was nowhere to be found. Panic set in, and I led the frantic search, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. But as the hours turned into days, hope dwindled. Driven by guilt and desperation, I decided to search the forest myself. Armed with a flashlight and a few supplies, I ventured into the dense woods, following the faint trails and broken branches that hinted at Sam's path. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. I walked for hours, the forest growing darker and more foreboding with each step. The once familiar sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, the cabin. It stood there, hidden among the trees, its presence almost ethereal in the dim light. A shiver ran down my spine as I approached, the air growing colder and heavier. The cabin's door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me inside. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but the thought of Sam gave me the courage to push the door open. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing a single room filled with old, rotting furniture and dust-covered shelves. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, carved deep into the wood, their meanings unknown. I called out for Sam, my voice echoing off the walls, but there was no response. As I moved further into the cabin, I felt a sense of dread growing within me, an almost tangible fear that something was terribly wrong. In the far corner of the room, I saw a trapdoor, partially hidden beneath a threadbare rug. With trembling hands, I pulled the rug aside and lifted the trapdoor. A cold, damp air wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor. I shone my flashlight down into the abyss, revealing a narrow staircase leading into the depths of the earth. Taking a deep breath, I descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The further down I went, the colder and darker it became until I reached the bottom. The flashlight's beam revealed a small subterranean chamber, its walls covered in the same strange symbols as the cabin above. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw what lay upon it. There, bound and unconscious, was Sam. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. I rushed to his side, frantically checking for injuries. As I worked to free him from his restraints, I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching us with cold, unblinking eyes. It was an old woman, her face gaunt and twisted with malice. Her clothes were tattered, and her skin was as pale as the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the ceiling. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What have you done to my brother?" The old woman stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "I am the guardian of this place," she said. "And your brother, he is mine now." Rage and fear surged through me, and I stood protectively over Sam. "He's not yours," I spat. "We're leaving." The woman laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed through the chamber. "You cannot leave," she said. "Not until the ritual is complete." I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed Sam, lifting him over my shoulder, and began to ascend the stairs. The old woman's laughter followed us, growing louder and more deranged. As we reached the top of the stairs, the trapdoor slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. Desperation fueled my strength as I pounded on the door, my fists bruising against the wood. "Let us out!" I screamed, but there was no response. Suddenly, the cabin filled with a blinding light, and I felt an intense heat radiating from behind me. I turned to see the symbols on the walls glowing with an otherworldly fire, the flames licking at the wood but leaving no scorch marks. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burning, and the old woman's voice filled the room, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. With a surge of adrenaline, I kicked at the trapdoor with all my might. It flew open, and I dragged Sam up the stairs and out of the cabin. The forest outside was alive with unnatural energy, the trees swaying violently as if caught in a storm. I ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, the old woman's chants echoing in my ears. As we broke through the tree line, the chanting stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent. I collapsed to the ground, cradling Sam in my arms, tears streaming down my face. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "You're safe now," I whispered, relief flooding through me. "We're safe." But as I looked around, I realized we were not out of the woods yet. The symbols were etched into the trees, glowing faintly in the darkness. The air was still thick with the scent of decay, and I knew we had to keep moving. We stumbled back to town, exhaustion and fear driving us forward. When we finally reached home, we were met with disbelief and relief. Sam was taken to the hospital, where he made a full recovery, but the experience left us both scarred. The cabin was never found. Despite multiple searches, it seemed to have vanished, leaving no trace behind. The town moved on, but the missing children were never forgotten, and neither was the old woman's laughter, which haunted my dreams. Years passed, but the memories remained vivid, a constant reminder of the darkness lurking in the forest. One night as I lay in bed, I heard a faint whisper in the wind, carrying the old woman's voice. "You cannot escape," she whispered. "The forest always takes its due." I knew then that the cabin was not gone, merely waiting, and that one day it would call again, drawing another lost soul into its grasp, and this time there would be no escape. I woke up to darkness. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, and my mouth felt dry and parched. As I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the dim light, the first thing I noticed was the rough texture of the concrete floor beneath me. I tried to sit up, but my body protested, stiff and sore from lying in an awkward position for what felt like hours. Gradually, my surroundings came into focus. I was in a small, windowless room, the walls bare and cold. A single, dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak, flickering shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no idea where I was or how I had gotten there. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body protesting. The room was empty except for a small metal cot pushed against one wall and a rickety wooden chair in the corner. The air was musty and stale, carrying a faint, metallic scent that made my stomach turn. The door, a heavy, rusted metal slab, stood ominously at the far end of the room. I stumbled towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the handle and twisted, but it was locked tight. Desperation clawed at me as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. "Hello? Is anyone there? Let me out!" My voice echoed in the confined space, but there was no response. I pounded on the door again, harder this time, but it remained stubbornly closed. I slumped against it, my mind racing with fear and confusion. How had I ended up here? The last thing I remembered was falling asleep in my own bed, the familiar comfort of my room enveloping me. Now I was trapped in this cold, empty cell, with no memory of how I had gotten here. I forced myself to take a deep breath and think. There had to be a way out. I walked around the room, searching for any clue or hidden exit. The walls were solid concrete, and the only light came from the flickering bulb above. I checked the cot and the chair, but there was nothing unusual about them. Then my eyes fell on a small, rectangular vent near the floor. It was just large enough to fit an arm through. I crouched down and peered inside, but all I could see was darkness. I reached in, my fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. A shiver ran down my spine as I pulled my hand back, revealing a small, rusted key. My heart leapt with hope. I scrambled to the door and tried the key in the lock. It fit, but the mechanism was old and rusty, and I had to jiggle it several times before it finally turned with a loud click. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the door handle, then pushed it open. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing a long, narrow hallway dimly lit by a series of flickering lights. The walls were the same cold, bare concrete, and the air was thick with the same musty scent. I stepped out into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind me with a resounding clang. I moved cautiously down the corridor, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of an exit. I passed several doors, all of them closed and locked. The sense of unease grew stronger with each step, the oppressive silence pressing down on me. Then I heard it, a faint, distant sound, like someone crying. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was coming from further down the hallway. I hurried towards it, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. As I rounded a corner, I saw another door slightly ajar, the crying growing louder. I approached cautiously, pushing the door open with a trembling hand. Inside was another small room, similar to the one I had woken up in. And there, huddled in the corner, was a young woman, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed. "Hey," I said softly, stepping into the room. "Are you okay?" She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My name is Alex," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I woke up in a room like this. I don't know how I got here. Do you?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I just woke up here. I don't remember anything." I crossed the room and knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get out of here," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "We'll find a way." She nodded, her sobs subsiding into quiet sniffles. I helped her to her feet, and we stepped back into the hallway together. The oppressive silence seemed even heavier now, but at least I wasn't alone. We continued down the hallway, checking each door we passed. Most were locked, but one opened into another small, empty room. There was no sign of an exit, no windows, nothing but the cold, bare walls and flickering lights. As we reached the end of the hallway, we found another door, this one slightly ajar. I pushed it open cautiously, revealing a large, dimly lit room. The air was even colder here, and the metallic scent was stronger. In the center of the room stood a large metal table, and scattered around it were various surgical instruments, all covered in a fine layer of dust. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what this room was. It looked like some kind of operating room, long abandoned. The woman beside me gasped, her hand tightening on my arm. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. I nodded, my own fear mounting. We turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. I rushed to it, pulling and pounding, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The woman's grip on my arm tightened, and I could hear her rapid, panicked breathing. "Stay close," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll find another way out." I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the room's grim details. The metal table, the surgical instruments, and the walls covered in strange, dark stains. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and a soft, whispering sound filled the room. It was like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. I swept the flashlight around the room, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The woman beside me whimpered, her fear palpable. I took her hand, trying to offer some comfort, but my own terror was rising. "We need to find another exit," I said, my voice shaking. "There has to be another way out." We moved cautiously through the room, the whispers growing louder with each step. At the far end, we found another door, this one slightly ajar. I pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. "Come on," I said, pulling the woman along with me. "This has to lead somewhere." We descended the stairs, the air growing colder and the whispers louder with each step. At the bottom, we found ourselves in another hallway, this one even narrower and more oppressive than the first. The walls seemed to close in around us, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows. We hurried down the hallway, checking each door we passed. Most were locked, but one opened into a small, dimly lit room. Inside, we found a window, covered by heavy bars. "Look," I said, pointing to the window. "We're underground. If we can find a way to break those bars, we can get out." The woman nodded, hope flickering in her eyes. We searched the room for something to use, and finally found a heavy metal pipe. Together, we worked to pry the bars loose, our fear driving us forward. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as we worked. I could feel a cold, oppressive presence closing in around us, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. Finally, the bars gave way, and we pushed the window open, the fresh air a welcome relief. I helped the woman through first, then climbed out after her. We found ourselves in a narrow alley, the night sky above us. "We made it," the woman said, her voice filled with relief. "We're out." But as I looked around, I realized we were still in the same nightmare. The alley was dark and oppressive, the buildings looming over us like silent sentinels. The whispers were still there, echoing in my mind. "We need to keep moving," I said, taking her hand. "We need to get as far away from here as possible." We ran through the alley, the darkness closing in around us. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the cold presence following us. Suddenly, the woman screamed and fell, her hand slipping from mine. I turned to help her, but she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I called out her name, but there was no response. Panic surged through me, and I ran, the whispers echoing in my ears. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The alley twisted and turned, the buildings closing in around me. Finally, I stumbled out into the open, the cool night air a welcome relief. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar. I was still trapped in the nightmare, unable to escape. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned, but there was no one there. The darkness closed in, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never wake up.